Just a quick word about the Phoenix Open. Don't let it scare you. Certainly don't let it keep you from attending church. The traffic on Sunday mornings really is really not a big deal at this time on Sunday mornings. It made me think 3 years ago at this time when the church was only about a month old, we had one service, and that was at 5 o'clock on Saturday nights. How many of you were at that service the weekend of the Phoenix Open? How many were you here at church? Yeah, that's about right. It was about me and about 20 of you. Apparently, Snoop Dogg at the Bird's Nest was more popular than we were. I mean, all right, if you got your Bibles, we're in John chapter 18. If you're new to the church, welcome. It's great to have you with us. We have for several months been studying the life of Jesus through a biography known as the Gospel of John, written by a friend of Jesus, a man who spent quite a bit of time with Jesus. He heard him speak, he saw the miracles, and actually participated in the miracles as well. And so he sits down, he puts pen to paper, and he says, let me tell you about what I know about this Jesus of Nazareth. So it's really cool because what you have in your hands is really an eyewitness account to the life of Jesus from one of his good friends, John. So I got to tell you, over the last couple of weeks, we're sort of in this high drama moment in the life of Jesus, and it's been sobering in my times of study. Because here's where we're at in the Jesus story. Hours earlier, Jesus has been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's surrounded by a mob, betrayed by... You ever been betrayed by a close friend? Jesus can relate. Judas betrays him, sells him out for essentially a few $100s. He's paraded before a series of law courts, but it's all a farce. It's a fake. It's a phony. They've broken so many laws. You can't try a man at night, but that's what they do to Jesus for the sake of expediency. The religious leaders hate him. They want him dead. You can't ask incriminating questions, but they're asking Jesus incriminating questions. So the whole thing is this kangaroo court. Eventually, he appears before the high priest, the guy that has a lot of power and authority, and he says, Jesus, just one question for you. Are you the Son of God? Are you the Messiah? To which Jesus responds affirmatively, it is so. That's all. That's the only answer they need. Now Jesus can appear before what is essentially a Jewish Supreme Court, and he's declared guilty of being a blasphemer, and the penalty for being a blasphemer was death by stoning. The challenge for the Jews is that they needed Roman authority. Living under Roman government, they couldn't carry out their own execution. So what they do next makes sense. They have to appear before the Roman governor in order to carry out the death sentence. So they appear before a man named Pontius Pilate. Now, this guy could care less that Jesus claims to be the Messiah. He doesn't care that Jesus claims to be the Son of God. That is no threat to Rome. However, if Jesus claims to be a king, that's different. That's insurrection. There is only one Roman king, that is the Emperor Tiberius, and all others will be put down. So Pilate asked Jesus, are you a king? Are you the king of the Jews? And then Jesus answers in a very ambiguous way. He says, yes, I am a king. But unlike a king you've ever known, Pilate, because you see, my kingdom is not of this world. I come from another place. I'm not here to establish political office, but rather I am a king that bears witness to the truth. Pilate asks, what is truth? And he turns around and he walks out. Pilate understands that he has before him this strange philosophical teacher, but certainly no one who is worthy of the death sentence. And so 6 times Pilate says, I find no guilt in this man. 6 times he declares Jesus not guilty. But the Jewish leaders are adamant about having Jesus put to death. And so Pilate he's in a very difficult place. He has a problem. On one hand, he's got this angry mob fueled by the Jewish religious leaders. And by the way, it's Passover. So nationalism for the Jews, the Israelites, it's at a yearly high. A couple million Jews descend on the city in celebration of Passover. He doesn't want to upset them. Additionally, the ancient historian Josephus tells us that they've already ratted Pilate out to the emperor, saying, this guy Pilate that you have to govern Judea, he's not doing a very good job. And so Tiberius sends word back to Pilate, get your act together, right? Do your job. So he's in a very difficult situation. All the while, he's got this guy in front of him who certainly doesn't deserve death. So he tries to release Jesus. John chapter 18 and verse 38. After he has said this, this refers to what is truth, having this conversation with Jesus and turning away. He went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. I can't find anything in this guy that's worthy of me putting him to death. He's no threat to Rome, but you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? They cried out. Imagine this mob shouting out, not this man, but Barabbas. And then John tells you that Barabbas was a robber. So, releasing one man during Passover was not a law. It was an accommodation made by Pilate in order to appease the Jews. Who do you want me to release? It's a custom that I release to you one person. Who do you want it to be? The King of the Jews? This man? And they say no. Not Jesus. We want you to release Barabbas. Now, John just says that Barabbas is a robber, but in Mark's account, he says that Barabbas was not only a robber, but he was a murderer, and that he was involved in, this is the Greek word, a stasis. A stasis, the Greek word is translated into the English as a riot. So Barabbas participated in this riot, and during this riot, he committed murder. This word is rich, though, with meaning. Stasis, hemostasis, right? The doctors in the room understand. Hemo means blood. Stasis means stoppage. Hemostasis is the stoppage of blood. A stasis, as a riot, is a stoppage of Rome. In other words, Barabbas was trying to prevent Rome, trying to stop Rome from doing something. He was an insurrectionist. To the Jews, Barabbas was a hero. And to the Romans, Barabbas was a terrorist. And so they say, oh, give us Barabbas. Give us our boy Barabbas. Let him go. Crucify Jesus. Once again, Pilate says, I don't find any guilt in this man. Now consider this scene. Barabbas is sitting in a jail cell. Essentially, he's in a Roman prison. Now, if you know anything about Roman prisons in the first century, they were not nice. Rome had no obligation to keep you alive. She was not going to spend one drop of her resources keeping you alive any longer than they had to, any longer than it took for them to prepare your crucifixion. How long does it take to forge nails? Nails were they were a commodity. So they would crucify someone and then pull those nails out. There's actually a really interesting piece of archaeology. It's kind of creepy, but it's a nail that's been driven in through bone, and then it was bent on the other end, on the other side of the wood. And so we can see how that nail was left in there because they couldn't pull it out. But they would reuse nails, and they would prepare the wood. So here's Barabbas. He knows what crucifixion was the Romans were constantly crucifying people. That was the power of Rome. That kind of fear within you. Because Barabbas was an insurrectionist, the Roman penalty was crucifixion. So he's sitting in this, he's waiting for the preparations to be made. Door opens up. Barabbas, get out. What do you mean get out? Get out. Get out. Barabbas, you're free to go. What happened? The King of the Jews, Jesus of Nazareth, he's being crucified in your place. You're free to go. Wow. If there was anyone who understood Jesus for you, his death in your place, it's Barabbas. And what's remarkable is that I think it's quite possible that the wood and the nails that were meant for Barabbas were used on Jesus, because Jesus was so quickly prepared for crucifixion. And the crowd says, we want Barabbas. We'll sacrifice Jesus. And so, we take a step back and we think about all these players, and we look at this angry mob and we think, people are so typical. People are so easily led astray. If you read the text carefully in all the Gospels, the Gospel writers say it was the religious leaders that incite the Jews to say, crucify him, deliver him up. Oh, people are so easily persuaded. And we look at someone like Pilate and we say, what a weak man. He knew the right thing to do. But self-preservation is powerful. He wanted to protect his position and his authority. We look at someone like Judas and we think, how could he betray a man that he saw Jesus perform miracles, and he sells them out for a few $100. And we look at these people and we shake our heads and we fail to look into our own hearts. People are still exchanging Jesus for Barabbas today. Their Barabbas might be lust. Their Barabbas might be greed. It might be intoxication. It might be a self-indulgent lifestyle. It could be a million different things. We see, and the thing is, we get pretty insidious about it because we can take good things and make them idols, make them functional saviors, and we end up trading Jesus for some other Barabbas. Where is that getting us? What do we need? Hey, what would help us, right? Isn't that the question? What would help enhance our commitment? What do we need to fight against our lack of dedication? What do we need? What would help us? Well, what would help us is actually what we get next. To understand it, chapter 19, verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. If you've seen Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, you have a pretty good idea of what takes place. Now, I'm not going to go into any gory details, and the reason why is because John doesn't. There's no attempt here to play on your emotions. John just uses one word. He says, he was flogged, or he was scourged. Person's bound, hands either to a tall column, leaning over, so the sides are exposed, or to a low column, so still the sides are exposed. Either hit with a rod or essentially like a leather whip, leather handle. Attached to the end of the whip, sharp objects like bone. And the purpose was to weaken the body. The purpose was to bring you close to death, but when they nailed you to a cross, by that point, you are putting up absolutely no resistance. Now, the Jews, 39 lashes, you might be familiar with, they had a number they attached to it. Romans, they had no number. Whatever it took to beat you down and weaken you. They weren't going to attach a number to it. It's as much as they thought you could take, bringing you this close. Then the text tells us that the soldiers place a crown, they twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe, right? Purple is the color of majesty. Now these are the soldiers, and they walk up to him and they say, "Hail, King of the Jews." So you know what a bunch of good old hardened soldiers, man, right? Roman life in the first century was very difficult. You needed something to break the ice. You wanted to have a little fun. This is what guys do. This is what soldiers do. And so they're totally mocking Jesus, making him appear as a king. "Hail, King of the Jews." Matthew says they put a reed in his hand, a little skinny little reed to imitate a scepter that a king would have, right? So they're just shaming him. And they struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." You say, "Well, you just tortured the guy." Yeah, but he didn't kill him. Pilate says, "Look, here he is, alive. I can't kill him. I'm not going to kill him. I can't bring myself to kill him. He's no threat to Rome. Here he is." It's interesting because when Paul writes about the suffering of Jesus, he mentions two things. In Philippians 2, he says that Jesus endured pain, death. Then he says, even death by crucifixion. So that speaks to the pain. Doesn't give you a lot of details. But then he adds this. He also bore the shame. See, it's one thing to be executed. It's another thing to be shamed in your execution. So very often, when they crucified you, they stripped you naked. Why? It's embarrassing. It's shameful. They didn't lift you up high. They lifted you up at about head space with those whom perhaps you offended. So they could take revenge on you as you're nailed to the cross. It was all part of the shame that went into it. Jesus endured the shame. So Jesus came out wearing a crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." Notice he doesn't say, "Behold the king." He says, "Behold the man." I think I'll explain why I think Pilate says it this way. Verse 6, when the chief priests and the officers, these are the religious leaders, when they saw Jesus, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I don't find this guy guilty." I think this is one last-ditch effort on Pilate's part to let Jesus go, to set him free. But it doesn't work. And he's trying intently. The word behold literally means to look intently. So here's what's happening. Pilate presents Jesus in front of this mob. And he says, stare at him. Look intently at this guy. Look at the blood. Look at the lacerations. Look at the spit. Look at the bruising. Look at the swollenness. Look at the sweat all mixed together. Look at this man. I don't find him guilty. Almost as if to say, has he not learned his lesson? Is this not enough? And what do they shout? Finish it. Finish it. Crucify him. The Jews answered him, sensing that Pilate might be backing off, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." And when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. So he entered his headquarters again, said to Jesus, "Where are you from? Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. You have to understand something about Pilate. This dude was a hardened man. This guy, he's used to killing. He's used to dealing with the Jews. He knows the players. He knows the chief priests. He knows Caiaphas. In fact, you can't get to those positions without being sympathetic to Rome. He knows these people. And yet when they make this statement, we have this law. It's like they're trying to tighten the screws. Pilate, it's Passover. You got a bunch of angry people in front of you. You don't want this to get out of hand. You don't want to upset Tiberius. Only you can make us happy. Only you can give us what we want. So they put it fully back on him. And the text says he was afraid. The Greek word is phobia. It's where we get our English word phobic. In other words, he's terrified. I'm not so sure that he's terrified by this mob. The reason why is because he turns back to Jesus and he says, "Where are you from?" I see this in this question, a real sincerity. He wants to know who is in front of him. And to understand where Jesus came from is to really understand who he is, by the way. See, previously, Jesus doesn't answer. Why? Because he's already answered once before. He said, "Hey, I'm not from here. My kingdom is not of this world." And so Jesus doesn't say anything because he's already answered the question. Additionally, Pilate is a Roman. And he understands Greek mythology and was probably a practitioner. And he understands also that every once in a while, at their whim, the Greek gods would enter humans. And now standing in front of him is this guy who says, you want to know where I'm from? I'm not from this planet. Now this isn't. See, it's one thing to offend the Greeks. It's another thing to offend. It's one thing to offend the Jews. It's another thing to offend the Greek gods. Who are you? Where did you say you came from? You're not from this planet. Who are you? Where do you come from? Jesus doesn't answer. Pilate wants answers, but Jesus isn't speaking. So what does Pilate do? He does the human thing. He asserts his power and authority. So Pilate said to him, you will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? Jesus answered him, you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. So Pilate steps up, and in an effort to exercise his power, Jesus says, you don't have the power. He doesn't say you don't have the power. He says the power you have has been given to you, implying that there's a greater power than you at work here. So let's talk about power for a second. Do you have it? Yes, you do. If you think of power as influence, you have power. Whether you're an employee or an employer, if you're a parent, you have tremendous power. What do you do with that? I think in response to the message from last Sunday, I was having dinner with a friend, and he asked, Jason, do you think Christians should go into politics? And I said, absolutely. Absolutely they should. And here's why. In 1991, President of Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, he won an award for his contribution to the betterment of European society. Sort of a humanitarian award. Now, Havel was an intellectual who never aspired to be a politician. And so his remarks are really interesting as an outsider, not wanting to be an insider, but found himself as a political insider, president of Czechoslovakia. And when he won this award, his acceptance speech was fascinating and profound. Let me quote part of it to you. He said, why is it that people long for political power? And why, when they have achieved it, are they so reluctant to give it up? Most are probably motivated by the natural longing every human being has for self-affirmation. Is it possible to imagine a more attractive way to affirm your own existence and its importance than that offered by political power? In essence, it gives you a tremendous opportunity to leave your mark, in the broadest sense, on your surroundings, to shape the world around you in your own image, to enjoy the respect that every political office almost automatically bestows upon the one who holds it. You see what he's saying? He's saying every single person in this room, including me, we have this deep desire for self-importance. We want to matter. We so desperately want to be valued. We want to be affirmed. And he says, I can't think of anything that satisfies that natural longing more than political office. This is why people are so reluctant to give it up. Once you get in, you don't want to there's respect. There's a lot of perks, right? You're elected to represent others. You speak for others. That's a tremendous amount of power. Man, that makes you feel really, really important. Political office gives you this undeniable identity, and it gives you the satisfaction of knowing that you are significant, unlike anything else. And this is why it is so very corrupting. because you don't want to give that up once you get it. And so you find yourself doing things that are not in the best interest of the people, but in the best interest of you preserving that need for self-importance through the position. So should Christians go into politics? Oh, absolutely. Why? Because Christians ought to make the best politicians because they don't need the power of the position. You say, well, wait a minute. They still have that need for self-importance and affirmation. Where do you get it? There's such a beautiful verse. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 14 and 15. He says, for the love of Christ controls us. It's not my job title. It's not CEO. It's not president. It's not pastor. None of that earthly power or authority controls the believer. Instead, it is the power of Christ's love that controls us. And he says this, we Christians, we've thought this through. Look what he says next. Because we have concluded, that word concluded, we've thought about it. And here's what we've concluded, that one has died for all. Therefore, all have died. What does he mean? He explains. And he died for all. Jesus died for everyone so that those who live might no longer live for themselves. In other words, that's what they died to. They died to themselves. It's another way of saying sin. They died to sin. They die to that desire to have anything and everything make us feel important. Does that make me feel important? I'll gravitate toward that. I want more of that. But for him who for their sake died and was raised. That raised part is very important, by the way. That demonstrates the power of Jesus over death. So in other words, what he's saying is this. Self-importance, affirmation, value for the Christian is found in one place, the cross of Jesus Christ. That is the source of your power. Therefore, Christians can be the absolute best politicians. They don't need the position. They don't need the power. Christians can be the absolute best parents. As parents, you'll relate to this. You spend so much of your time pouring your life into your kids because you love them and you want to help them. And so you say things to them at a very young age. You say, hey, listen, Johnny, don't lie. Hey, Johnny, I want to remind you, share your toys. Be polite. And then there's that moment when your kid gets it right without you saying anything. Hey, you can have my toy. And you're like, did you see that? Did you see what Johnny just did? Did you see what our son just did? The parent says, Johnny, you're such a good boy. You're such a good boy. And what does the child do? He lights up. He glows. He's basking in the affirmation and the sense of self-importance from his mom and dad. Just eating it up. You are a child of God. And you were meant to find your self-importance in the love of God expressed through the death of his son on the cross. In other words, that's how God feels about you. But in our humanness, we gravitate toward the position. We gravitate toward the thoughts of others and what they think about us. You ever meet the parents whose kids always do the right thing and they're always perfect, and you're like, that parent is so annoying. Right? I mean, it's just they have one of those super well-behaved kids who is actually living in fear of doing anything wrong. And the parent's looking at you like, what's your problem? What's happening with that parent? They're getting power in the wrong place. Power in the wrong place. This is how insidious it is. Our desire for self-importance and affirmation, it just spills out onto everything we do. So this verse is so beautiful because when you get this verse deep into your heart, it changes you. You want to know why Jesus was so influential? This is the most powerful man who ever lived. And moments before his arrest, he's with his disciples. And I love this passage. This is the best principle of leadership you'll ever find. He's about to share the Passover meal with his disciples. And the text tells us that he gets up and he takes off his outer garment, puts on a towel, and he washes the disciples' feet. You know what verse precedes that? The verse that says Jesus, knowing that all authority in heaven had been given to him. In other words, in that moment, he's the most powerful man who has ever lived, and he knows it. And what does he do? I'm going to wash your feet. That's power, found in the right place. When you find your power in the love of God, you understand my power is here to serve others. My power is here to meet the needs of others because that's exactly what our leader did for us. Oh, and by the way, you will be held accountable. Jesus says, look, Pilate, you're to blame. You're held responsible. But the guys that delivered me up to you are more responsible. Who's he talking about? He's talking about the religious leaders. They should have known better. They could not deny that Jesus did miracles. They followed him around. They heard it. Hey, the thing that sparked it was when Jesus raised a man from the dead, and they were like, I guess it's true. Oh, he does that by the power of Satan. They couldn't deny it. They had to excuse it away to protect their own power. He says they're more responsible than you. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. Pilate's like, I'm shook by this conversation. I got to set this guy free. But the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. They're tightening the screws on Pilate. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat. It's over now. Once the governor sits on the judgment seat, the Greek word is bimatos. By the way, Paul says that God has one of these, and every believer will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Is going to be placed in this, we'll read this word Gabbatha. Gabbatha means elevated. It means raised. So here's Pilate. He sits in this judgment seat. So this is what governors do when they're about to pass judgment. So now we know it's coming. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha, raised. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, somewhere between morning and noon. He said to the Jews, behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Oh, what a ridiculous statement. These are the chief priests. They're supposed to go from God to them to everybody else. And what are they doing? They say, no, our king is Caesar. Caesar was a Roman pagan who thought he was a god. They're saying this just to get Jesus killed. Verse 16. So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Pilate, he disobeyed his conscience because of fear, right? Fear of personal loss. Can you relate? Mm-hmm. And so can I. We desperately want to be liked and valued and affirmed. We all have this innate need and desire for self-importance. But when the love of God controls you, when the cross sinks into your heart, you can deal with power. We don't rule in Jesus' name, but rather when Jesus' name is in the center of our hearts, then it's safe for us to rule. So you can go into political office. You can be the boss. You can be the employee. You can be the parent. And you can be the best at it and the most influential because you've already had your heart filled with the true sense of power, and that is through the love of God. You don't need anything else. So how are you doing with your power? How are you doing with your influence? Is it being used to serve others? Or is it being used to prop up your own sense of self-importance? And by the way, that will be to your own undoing. So, Father, there's so much here, once again, from the good words of Jesus. Even in those moments where he remains silent, he's screaming. The power of his love demonstrated through the cross. God, may that control us. May that be true of Illuminate Community Church. And it would be so visible. It would become so obvious. God, I ask that by the power of your Spirit, you'd continue to impress upon each heart here what it is that you would have us realize has been exchanged. Jesus for Barabbas. What are the Barabbases? And then, God, give us the courage to step into that love, the love that you have for us, and declare our loyalty and obedience. For our blessing, and for the sake of the renown of your good name. And it's in the name of Jesus Christ that we ask. And God's people said, amen.